So lastly, we're going to look at smooth muscle, briefly go over the gross anatomy of it, also look at microscopic anatomy, and then physiology, how it actually works. So when we look at smooth muscle, it's going to be non-striated, meaning we see no striations, no matter what the power is, and it's going to be involuntary, which once again, it's not underneath conscious control. There's two main forms. There's visceral smooth muscle. This is going to be found in large sheets. And it's going to be along walls of hollow organs, so things like our intestines, the uterus, the bladder. And visceral smooth muscle is very important for actually having peristaltic waves. They actually end up moving in these large sheets that have the wave-like sweeping motion to it to move things forward like ingesta inside of the intestines, or allow for parturition by expelling the fetus out of the uterus, or by contracting the bladder to allow for urination. So these large groups of muscles having that wave-like contraction of peristalsis is very important in their functions with the various organs, whereas the other type is multi-unit smooth muscle, and these are single cells or small groups of cells. We call them discrete. They're not in a big sheet of cells, and instead they work individually as a small group to do more fine movements or to work in different glands to actually expel the content of the glands. So some examples here is the erector pili muscles. So these attach to the hair and they work individually to move the hair in an effort to control body heat or as a communication signal like a dog's hackles going up, or in expressing things like the mammary glands, so doing what we call milk letdown, or the salivary glands right before an animal eats or during their eating to where they have saliva being released. So once again, the key things is this is going to be an involuntary muscle, not under conscious control. It's not going to be striated at all. When we look at them, these are really small cells. We call them spindle shaped. They have a central nucleus. There's many of these in a high-powered slide. So we can see all these right here with their individual nuclei. And they have a smooth, homogeneous appearance, which is the reason why they get the name smooth muscle. There's no striations. They all look something alike and equal. What these cells do is where we look at cardiac muscle or skeletal muscle and they contract down the length where the striations, these actually contract and actually shrink the whole cell. It actually almost tries to ball up. And the reason why it has a smooth appearance and it's not striated is we actually kind of crisscross our actin and myosin fibers in here. And so what we end up having is what's called dense bodies at either side of the cell in a smooth muscle cell. And so this dense body would be about the same thing as a Z-line in skeletal muscle or in cardiac muscle when we look at it. And so your actin and myosin units contract, and they contract at an angle, and they go all the way across the smooth muscle cell, and they don't line up perfectly. Like I said, they're crisscrossing, and they actually shrink the size of the cell. So the cell goes from full size to where it actually physically shrinks all the way around in size, just not in length, but in actual width and length and full diameter around. So once again, visceral smooth muscle, this is going to be found in the walls of internal organs like the stomach and intestines with the digestive tract, the uterus with the reproductive tract, and the urinary bladder. Large sheets of cells, they actually contract in rhythmic ways, and they actually contract without any external stimuli. So there's no direct input from the nervous system to tell them when to actually contract. Instead of what they do is when they actually start to stretch, we actually have pacemaker cells that when they're stretched out slightly by distension, all at once they start the contraction, and then that starts all the other muscles. They work in a wave. They actually communicate much like cardiac muscle, but we don't have intercalated discs. Once one actually sits there and starts to stretch, it all at once contracts, and then that contraction causes all the others to start to contract, and that's where we get the peristaltic wave going through at. They are innervated by two different systems, the sympathetic and the parasympathetic nervous systems. Also, they will respond to the hormones of the sympathetic nervous system, which is epinephrine and norepinephrine. Sympathetic nervous system ends up decreasing activity, so it stops things like the stomach and intestines from moving, causes what we call ileus. It actually decreases uterine contractions during parturition. It will actually cause the urinary bladder to become static and not to force out urine. Whereas the parasympathetic nervous system, its actual input to it, and there's no direct hormones there, but when it's in influence and the sympathetic nervous system goes away, then visceral smooth muscle goes through its normal actions. Multi-unit smooth muscle, these are individual cells or small groups of cells. So some additional examples to what we started off the chapter with is going to be the iris and the ciliary bodies of the eye. So actually your pupil is going to be controlled through smooth muscle. So is your lens for focusing. That is all smooth muscle. Walls of a lot of your small blood vessels, especially your arteries and arterioles, are going to be controlled through multi-unit smooth muscle. And this multi-unit smooth muscle ends up determining the diameter of the vessels, whether they need to be dilated or constricted. And then the small airway passages in the lungs. So this is going to be your bronchioles. They don't actually have cartilage rings that actually hold them together. They're actually open and closed, and their diameter and the smaller airways in the lungs are going to be determined by multi-unit smooth muscle. On top of things that we looked at like in glands, so the mammary and salivary glands, and also the erector pili muscle. And a lot of times these are actually underneath direct control of the autonomic nervous system. Specifically, you're going to have one reaction if we have the sympathetic nervous system stimulated, and a lot of that times that can be potentially impairing function, and this impaired function actually causes things like the pupils to dilate when it's underneath their control. It can actually cause things like the blood vessels to dilate, especially in specific areas of the body. Sometimes with sympathetic nervous system input too, it actually causes hair to actually stand up, and then parasympathetic nervous system puts everything back at rest, back at its normal actions for those smooth muscle cells doing the normal functions of the body. So that was smooth muscle and the muscular system.